Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Chapter 4 in our Problems in International Politics lectures. This chapter 4 will be dedicated to Donald Trump's foreign policy too. We saw in our chapter 3 that Donald Trump, since he arrived at the White House, put into practice his America First slogan, his America First doctrine, that is to say, he adopted protectionist policies in the domain of trade relations. He withdrew. He decided America should withdraw from international regimes, various international institutions and organizations. He accused America's allies, we'll come back to this in our chapter 5, of benefiting from America's military protection without paying their dues. And we came to the conclusion that in doing so, Donald Trump is likely to upset the international liberal order that has been prevailing since World War II, since the end of World War II, and that his predecessors, the other American presidents, had consolidated or at least respected most of the time. We also ascribed in this chapter 3 Trump's decisions to systemic factors. That is to say, we considered that the decisions, the actions of Donald Trump were the consequences of America's decline, since America had been regime maker when dominating the world. Since America nowadays is relatively declining as compared to the rise of the rapidly rising China, since therefore America profits less from existing regimes, existing norms, it is no longer in its interest to respect them. It is no longer in America's interest to respect those norms, those rules that America itself had established in the immediate aftermath of World War II by positing such a direct link between America's relative decline and Trump's decision. We somehow denied Trump any agency. We did not recognize him as a statesman because we considered him to be a mere transition belt of systemic factors to which he was submitted. He could not but act the way he is acting because of the systemic constraints. And in doing so, we adopted a structural approach, basically a neo-realist one, claiming that foreign policy behavior of a state is basically determined, not merely shaped, but actually determined by the systemic distribution of power resources among major powers. In chapter 4, in today's chapter, I would like to rehabilitate Trump as an actor, as an agent. That is to say, I will posit the assumption, starting point, that leadership matters in international relations too. That is to say, I would like to take Trump seriously as a decision maker, not merely as a transition belt of systemic factors. He does not merely act under the constraint of systemic factors, but he shapes, adopts, practices a foreign policy which is influenced by his own beliefs, his own convictions, his own political program. To take Trump seriously, that is to say, to claim that he acts as a rational statesman. To take Trump seriously is anything but self-evident, because a lot of people, journalists, media, citizens, claim he acts like a narcissistic person, driven by lust for money, driven by lust for power, domination, and to some extent undoing systematically what Obama had decided. To get rid of the Iran deal because it had been signed by Obama, to put an end to the Trans-Pacific Partnership that had been established by Obama, etc., etc. Since I am an international relations specialist, I'm not, rightly or wrongly, of course, I'm not very fond of psychological explanations. And I prefer, therefore, to resort to international relations discipline frameworks to try to account for his foreign policy behavior. However unpredictable this behavior may be or may seem, at least at first sight. So who then, international relations in the discipline, takes statesmen seriously? Which approach locates the major causes, the major explanations of statesmen's decisions at the level of the individual actor, a level of analysis, rather than the system level of analysis? Let's have a very quick look at the theories concerned. First of all, classical realism, though positing the rationality, and to some extent the perfect rationality of statesmen, classical realism does not consider that they are free to do what they want. Take the example of Morgenthau. In his Politics Among Nations, he considers that statesmen pursue the national interest, defined in terms of power. Or whoever the statesman may be. Listen to Morgenthau. The concept of interest, national interest, defined as power, provides for rational discipline in action and creates that astounding continuity in foreign policy, regardless, this is important, of the different motives, preferences, and intellectual or moral qualities of successive statesmen. So whoever the statesman or the stateswoman, they cannot but act on behalf of the national interest, whatever their personal specificities, including their personal opinions. So there is no freedom to act for statesmen in the classical realist conception of foreign policy. Classical realism was criticized in the 50s and the 60s by behaviorism, the behavioral revolution in American social science. And behaviorists introduced a kind of limited agency. That is to say, they recognized that the statesman's rationality was not perfect, but the agency that they do recognize is biased too. Allison considered that statesmen's decisions are biased by bureaucratic and organizational constraints. He does not take decisions alone. He is influenced by all those who contribute to the final decision by providing information, by trying to exert pressure upon him, etc., etc. So there is a kind of agency, but it is biased due to the sociological constraints of the decision-making process. The second set of behaviorist scholars consider that statesman's rationality is also biased by a limited, cognitive features characterizing the perception of realities. In other words, statesmen act on the basis of what they perceive subjectively, rather on what the reality objectively consists in. And pretty often, and this is their contribution, these perceptions are inadequate, wrong, that is to say, misperceptions. So here there is a kind of degree of agency, but it is a negative one. That is to say, the statesman is unable to correctly perceive the reality, and so the decisions are based on misperception. The third set of approaches to foreign policy is neo-liberalism. Neo-liberalism, which goes back to the midst of the 1990s. Neoliberalism, the most important author here is Andrew Moravcsik, who wrote a short article after publishing his analysis of the European community. His article is called "Taking Preferences Seriously, a Liberal Theory of International Politics." According to Moravcsik, statesmen, when undertaking actions on the international scene, do promote different interests of societal actors. There is no such thing as a national interest. There are only private interests, and every group within the society tries to exert the pressure upon the government, the president, the statesman, in order for this statesman to adopt a policy which promotes their specific private interests. So here there is a kind of reversed model. It's no longer the top-down of the neo-realists, but it is the bottom-up model of the new liberals. This foreign policy actually reflects societal interests, some societal interests, rather than other ones, and there is no national interest. So if classical, and of course neo-realists, do not recognize any agency, behaviorists and neoliberals acknowledge a kind of limited biased agency. Statesmen are constrained either by their psychological limits or by bureaucratic organizational routines or by societal groups. There is therefore, I would say, one approach which takes statesmen somehow seriously. It is the neoclassical realist approach. The neoclassical realist approach, neoclassical realism, the state and foreign policy, a fairly recent approach which tried to combine, as indicated in its label, classical realism with neo-realism. That is to say, according to neoclassical realists, on the long run, the foreign policy of the states is indeed driven first and foremost by the relative place of a state within the international structure. That is to say, the international system on the long run determines what the state is able to do, but on the short run, the concrete foreign policy actions, in other words, are influenced by two intervening variables: the statesman's perception, and this perception is not necessarily a misperception, and the statesman's freedom relative to the civil society. That is to say, the statesman is not necessarily the prisoner of societal interests. He or she is able to shape the public opinion or the interests of different groups. I repeat, the neoclassical realist approach considers that foreign policy actions, the so-called dependent variable, is due both to the independent variable, which is the state's relative position in the international system, and by two intervening variables: the statesman's perception, how he perceives or she perceives the reality, and how he manages to set himself free from the pressures exerted bottom-up by the different societal groups. It is this neoclassical realist approach then that I will implicitly apply here in this chapter 4. Very concretely, ladies and gentlemen, what does that mean? This means that I take Trump's convictions about foreign policy somehow seriously. His convictions, his conceptions of America's role on the world political stage. And to understand this division, I think we should logically have a look at the different foreign policy traditions that, since America became an independent state, those traditions that shaped the different presidents' actions and decisions. So we have to go back, in other words, to the end of the 18th century, when America's founding fathers laid down the basic doctrines that were to guide the different American presidents. We will see what these traditions consist in, how they evolved, how they were put into practice by the different presidents who, of course, used various combinations of these traditions or these doctrines, and how, the last point of today's class, of course, how Trump's own ideas reflect one or another, or maybe an original one of the other of these traditions, or maybe an original one specific to Donald Trump himself. So let's go back to history. And let's go back to 1776, when America, thanks to its war of independence against the British, became independent. When America became independent, the founding fathers agreed upon the domestic political regime that America should adopt. They were influenced by John Locke's political philosophy, that is to say, they wanted no monarchy, they wanted a republic characterized by the separation of powers, the executive, the legislative, and then at that time the federative power, the judiciary power actually was does not go back to John Locke himself. Anyway, so there was a consensus in domestic politics, but there was no such consensus in the domain of America's foreign policy, in the domain of the foreign political attitude that America should adopt once independent. And the American founding fathers themselves, the first presidents, in other words, were torn between divergent diplomatic guidelines. These divergent, contending guidelines, principles were put forward notably by two men, two thinkers who also were practitioners, of course. The first one is Alexander Hamilton, and the second one is Thomas Jefferson. Alexander Hamilton, first of all, was one of the three Federalists, together with James Madison and John Jay. The Federalists, maybe you know that, the Federalist Papers, this is what they published. They published their papers, their articles in the then newspapers. You know that America became independent in 1776, but it became only the United States in 1787, that is to say 11 years later, when the 13 first American states decided to create a union. And this union had as its basic legal framework the American Constitution, the Federal Constitution. Therefore, those founding fathers that were favorable to such an American federal constitution were called the Federalists. So they published various articles in order to convince, of course, the then American citizens who had just become independent to vote in favor of such a federal constitution. It worked. America in 1787 became a federal state. So various articles regarded international politics, and it was Hamilton who wrote these articles. So what then was Hamilton's conception? According to Alexander Hamilton, international politics was a never-ending state of war. He was a realist. Sooner or later, he said, America would be confronted to those characteristics that European powers were confronted to, that is to say, the risks of war. In other words, the US, sooner or later, would be involved in power political disputes and quarrels and maybe wars. And therefore, the US had to consolidate its own power, economically speaking, in order to cope, materially speaking, in order to cope successfully with those prospective dangers emanating from European powers. We should not forget, that at that time, of course, Spain was dominating Latin America, and Great Britain, of course, was dominating Canada after the French had been defeated in Quebec during the 7 Years' War in 1763. So the US should consolidate economically its own resources in order to cope with those dangerous. And regarding the alliances that America should accept, Hamilton was in favor of becoming an ally of the UK and not of France, despite France had helped the US to become independent. Lafayette, you know, that helped Washington to become independent, to defeat the British. Why should America nevertheless accept Great Britain as the major ally? Because, I quote, Britain was perceived to be a lesser evil than France. This is typical of realists. Realists consider that alliances should be shifting. It was in America's interest to be supported by France against Great Britain. Once America is independent, it is in its interest to become an ally of Great Britain, less threatening, according to Hamilton, than France. So Hamilton, a realist. And then we have Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson can be called an idealist as opposed to a realist. That is to say, he thought that it would be possible gradually to get rid of war as the most important characteristic of international politics. It is possible to get rid of the disposition to war thanks to moral progress. And according to Jefferson, the US had the possibility to contribute to this moral progress at one condition, that it pursued itself a national interest based on, I quote, moral duties, not based on power, but based on, defined in terms of moral duties. And to be successful, America had to keep off European power politics, to remain aloof from European affairs, and this policy, according to Jefferson, was possible thanks to the huge Atlantic Ocean, separating, of course, the American continent from the European powers. So kind of contradiction, competition between two different conceptions. The way out of this competition was found by America's first president, that is to say, George Washington. George Washington, in his farewell address after his 2 mandates as the first American president, his farewell address, have a look at document number 1 in the final model. Listen to Washington. The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is, in extending our commercial relations, to have with them, the European powers, the foreign nations, to have with them as little political connection as possible, to extend our commercial relations, to have as little political connection as possible. Our detached and distant situation, the fact that America is located west of the Atlantic Ocean rather than east of the Atlantic Ocean. Our detached and distant situation invites and enables us to do what? To pursue a different course. That is to say, it permits us not to entangle our peace and prosperity in the toils of European ambitions, rivalries, interests. We can keep aloof from Europe. And thanks to this, we will extend our commercial relations, that is to say, improve our wealth. It is, and this is important, it is our true interest to steer clear of permanent alliances, to steer clear of permanent alliances. No permanent alliance. And you may know that America never accepted to be member of a permanent alliance before 1949. That is to say, during 150 years, America never was part of a permanent alliance. It only was part of temporary alliances. We may safely trust to temporary alliances for extraordinary emergencies. Last sentence of the farewell address that I do quote. It was in 1949 that America abandoned this doctrine by accepting to become a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But you may know also that this North Atlantic Treaty Organization had been asked by the Europeans and the Americans nearly 2-3 years or so before the majority of their representatives, their congressmen, accepted that America should abandon, drop this starting point to steer clear of permanent alliances, to pursue a different course, to merely trust on temporary alliances. So there is a compromise, which George Washington was able to put forward, the compromise between Jefferson and Hamilton, to extend commercial relations in order to permit America to consolidate its economic richness. This is Hamilton's recommendation. To have as little political connection as possible, to steer clear of permanent alliances. This is Jefferson's contribution. And of course, America, from that moment onwards, produced an idealist discourse, claiming that if America was different, it was because of its exceptionalism, because of its manifest destiny, because America perceived, and sometimes still perceives nowadays, itself as the beacon of freedom, as the city upon the hill. Biblical influences go back to the Pilgrim Fathers. But you also see that Washington's message, to some extent, contains, at least implicitly, a kind of unilateralist option. We may safely trust to temporary alliances. If you trust to temporary alliance, this means that you will not take into account what your allies think of your abandoning them. We focus on our freedom to act. So somehow nationalist or unilateralist. So Trump's behavior nowadays is not that radically incompatible with the past of America, though the context, of course, is different. That is the reason why he's criticized by those who are favorable to the liberal international order. Anyway, Washington's farewell address, I come back to the historical survey. Washington's farewell address shaped America's foreign policy throughout the 19th century. America adopted its isolationist policy, no interference in Europe, and it adopted a unilateralist policy method, no permanent alliance, in order to be able to decide on its own. This is what Walter McDougall calls the Old Testament of America's foreign policy traditions or doctrines, the Old Testament that was prevailing throughout the 19th century. America will remain isolationist. And of course, this tradition, this practice reflected a mixture, a combination of interest and of moral conviction. The interest, of course, the rational dimension of this practice is easy to understand. America at that time was weak compared to the European powers, compared to France, maybe even to Spain, and above all to Great Britain. So it was in America's interest to keep off the European continent. If America had had the courage to get entangled in European affairs, it would have been defeated by, of course, notably the British. So to remain aloof from the European continent was a question of interest, as much as a question of ethics, of ethical, moral conviction, of course. At that time, Spain was still occupying, today's southern US, from Florida to California via Texas, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, even Utah to some extent. So, and of course, the British still dominated, still were present in the north of the US, that is to say, in Canada. Anyway, throughout this 19th century, America acted defensively. And the best illustration of this defensive stance will be the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine, adopted in 1823 by the then American president, James Monroe. And this is what Monroe said when America, the US, was confronted by the possibility of European powers intervening on the European continent. 1823, beginning of the wars of independence fought in the then Spanish colonial territories from Mexico to Argentina. Those Latin Americans that no longer wanted to be part of the Spanish Empire, that wanted to become independent. So what did Spain do? What did Spain consider to do? It was thinking of appealing to the Holy Alliance. The Holy Alliance that was adopted in 1815 in Europe included Prussia, Russia, and Austria. That is to say, the three Central and East European absolutist monarchies that wanted to prevent any revolutionary upheaval in Europe, because such upheaval had been at the origin of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. But Spain thought that they also would be eager to send their troops to maintain order in the Spanish Empire in Latin America. So there was a risk from the American perception, there was a risk of American troops landing in South and Central America. And this is what Monroe absolutely refused to accept. Listen to Monroe in his speech that was called the Monroe Doctrine, document number 2 in your Moodle file. In the wars of the European powers, in matters relating to themselves, when Europeans clash against each other, we Americans have never taken any part. And we will never do so. It is only when our rights are invaded or seriously menaced, threatened, that we make preparations for our defense. When we feel threatened, then we will prepare ourselves to defend ourselves. It is a defensive doctrine, the Monroe Doctrine. We should consider any attempt on the part of Europeans, to extend their system to this hemisphere, to the Western Hemisphere, North and South America, as dangerous to our peace and safety. If ever European troops should land, they should arrive either in North, Central, or South America, then our peace, our security, our safety would be endangered. It is impossible that the Allied powers of Spain, should extend their political system to any portion of North or South America without endangering our peace and happiness. It is impossible that we should behold such interposition in any form of indifference. We will not be indifferent if Spain or other European powers sent their troops to prevent the Latin Americans from becoming independent. So the Monroe Doctrine, pretty often misinterpreted, we'll come back to this in 2 or 3 minutes, actually is a defensive doctrine. Up to the Monroe Doctrine, the Europeans, ladies and gentlemen, the European powers considered the American continent, but also Africa, of course, and to some extent Asia and Australia, as open territories open to their conquest. For the first time in history, a non-European power, though the European offspring, the US, told the Europeans, stop, you don't go further. I will not accept your intervention in our North and South American continent. So it is a defensive doctrine, which therefore is part of the broader isolationist tradition of America. This isolationist tradition prevailed during 100 full years, 1 full century, and things started to change, temporarily at least, at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. Why? Because the US gradually became economically rich and therefore prospectively powerful. We saw in our chapter 2, when looking at China's rise, that those who are afraid of America no longer being number 1 in the world economy emphasize that America has been number 1 since the 1870s, since the presidency of Ulysses Grant. So in the 1890s, America gradually became aware that it had significant economic resources which could permit it to be ambitious on the world political stage. So American elites started thinking again about what to do and about how to proceed. that is, say, should they drop isolationism or not, and which objectives should they pursue? In other words, new debates started, and these two debates are perfectly summed up in McDougall's Promised Land, the Crusader State. He calls this new period, which starts at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, and those traditions, those doctrines that were adopted, invented, conceived during this period, as which go on shaping or went on shaping America's foreign policy behavior up to Obama. Trump is different. We'll come back to this, of course. He calls these doctrines the New Testament, no longer the Old Testament synonymous with isolationism, but the New Testament synonymous with interventionism, prospective in the first period up to World War II, and then effective after World War II, America's interventionism. So two new debates emerged. The first debate regarded the substance of America's internationalism or interventionism. The substance. What should America's foreign policy consist in? Which objectives should it pursue? Should it pursue America's material interests, as claimed by Hamilton? Or should it privilege America's values, freedom, democracy, the triumph of law, human rights, private markets, etc.? This debate opposed liberals influenced by Jefferson to realists influenced by Hamilton. According to the realists, America should pursue material interests. According to the liberals, America should pursue its values, spread its values. The second debate regarded the method, the foreign policy method. How should America proceed in order to pursue either material interests, economic richness, military, political security, or when looking for values. So which method? Should America act alone as it had done throughout the 19th century? Or should America cooperate with other states? Since America now no longer was isolationist, and maybe therefore it should also adopt a new method, since the context had evolved. Some people during this debate claimed that America should be loyal to its past and therefore go on doing it alone, acting alone, that is to say, acting unilaterally. And other ones, on the contrary, of course, claim that America no longer could act unilaterally because of the new context, and America therefore should act multilaterally together with other states. These two debates are then at the origin of four possible combinations, or four possible strategies or doctrines, traditions: unilateral realism, unilateral liberalism, multilateral liberalism, multilateral realism, or the other way around, realist unilateralism, liberal multilateralism, and realist multilateralism. Unilateral realism means that America acts alone, imposes its will, offensively. Realism, power politics. Unilateral liberalism means that America acts alone, but to impose, notably, its values much more than its interests. That is to say, it is a kind of imperialistic leadership. Liberal multilateralism means that America accepts to pursue collective security, associating other powers, and when promoting human rights, it acts on the basis of international institutions, the UN Charter. Realist multilateralism means that America practices a defensive power politic, that is to say, it intervenes selectively to maintain the existing order rather than to impose it. its order. So let's then look how, since the beginning of the 20th century, the end of the 19th century, when these debates emerged, let's have a look at how the different American presidents, which tradition, which doctrine, which practice they did adopt. The first important president we have a look at will be Teddy Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, the first Roosevelt, who was a realist unilateralist. That is to say, he wanted America to impose its power violently in order to promote its national interests, defined in terms of both national security, national interest, and economic richness. He adopted the so-called big stick policy. The big stick policy consisted in saying, and this is how he summed up, speak softly and carry a big stick. You speak softly, but you carry a big stick in order to impose your will, violently if necessary. And he adopted the Roosevelt corollary. The Roosevelt corollary, difficult to express, is the offensive new version of the defensive Monroe Doctrine. That is to say, no longer should America prevent Europeans from intervening in Latin America, but America, North America, the US itself, has the right to intervene in order to maintain those regimes, those orders that are favorable to American, notably economic interests and strategic interests too. This is the big stick policy, which transformed Latin America into America's backyard, which still to some extent is the case, with the exception of Cuba. This big stick policy announced America's transformation into the then typical European unilateral realist behavior. But to some extent, Roosevelt wanted America to have its own colonial empire. And so he decided to intervene against Spain in Cuba, which became independent, legally speaking, but actually which was America's playground, economic and in other domains, and this explains, this contributes to explain the revolution of Castro and Guevara in 1959. It waged a war, the US, against Spain in the Philippines, to permit the Philippines also to become somehow independent. It also intervened in Panama in order to control the zone of the Canal of Panama. It also intervened in some specific islands, Guam, etc., which permitted America to have the sovereignty over these small islands in the Pacific Ocean. So it was indeed an imperial or an imperialist moment, but it was a short-lived moment, which did not survive Roosevelt. In other words, America at that time made proof of imperial understretch. It had the economic means, richness, to be imperially active, but it did not practice an imperial expansionist policy, and therefore Fareed Zakaria, in his book From Wealth to Power, calls this behavior imperial understretch. Why did America behave relatively moderately, given its huge resources, according to Zakaria? Because of the still prevailing both isolationist tradition to some extent, and also because of the then prevailing liberal values or idealist values which go back to Jefferson. So a purely materialist definition of the national interest was impossible on the long run. It was only very possible during a short moment, that is to say during McKinley's and above all during Teddy Roosevelt's presidency. The American values, which go back to the founding fathers, Jefferson, etc., were still preeminent, and these values will be at the origin of the second internationalist moment of America, synonymous with Woodrow Wilson's presidency, and above all with Woodrow Wilson's presidency after the end of World War I, or after America entered World War I in 1970. Woodrow Wilson was driven by a Jeffersonian approach. He wanted America, first and foremost, to diffuse its values: freedom, human rights, independence, collective self-determination of the peoples, and not material interests. Listen to Wilson. I believe that America should be ready to vindicate at whatever cost, the principles of liberty, of justice, and humanity. So we should spread liberty, even if it costs us, materially speaking. We shall, I go on, never again take another foot of territory by conquest. So he rejects what Teddy Roosevelt had done. We shall never, in any circumstances, seek to make an independent people subject to our dominion. We shall no longer submit any independent people. Why? Because we passionately believe in the right of every people, to choose their own allegiance, to be free of masters altogether. We want no colonial or imperial spheres of control. We want every people to become independent, to remain independent. We will not conquer any territory anymore. So a very liberal program. This is also the program that he proposed to post-World War I Europe in his 14 points speech at the origin of the League of Nations. And since Wilson was eager to promote liberty, of course, he could not impose, logically speaking. He could not come to the conclusion that this liberty should be imposed unilaterally. He therefore also was favorable to multilateralism. So Wilson was a multilateral liberal, or a liberal multilateralist, resulting to institutional cooperation in order to extend liberty, to extend free market, to extend the triumph of law. It would be a contradiction in terms to impose freedom by violent means, to impose it unilaterally. And this is the reason why he accepted. He came to the conclusion that America should propose the League of Nations. The League of Nations would have meant that America no longer was free to act unilaterally, because it would have to take into account the other member states of the League of Nations. In other words, by adopting a multilateral stance, Wilson accepted that America had its hand tied by the other states. And this probably explains why the majority of the then US Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, which included the League of Nations Charter. America therefore did not become a member of the League of Nations. It remained unilateral in its methods, though promoting or claiming that it promoted, first and foremost, values rather than material interests. The third stage of America becoming internationalist, that is to say, deciding to intervene, and this time to definitely drop any isolationist behavior that had characterized the first century after its independence. This third internationalist moment arrived at the end of World War II with the second Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was influenced by Wilson. This means that he was opposed both to unilateralism and he was opposed to alliance politics. He wanted also an international association of nations to be established. This international organization was to become the UN. The UN was multilateral. The aim of Roosevelt was to prevent any new world war similar to the second or even to the first world war to break out. And in order to be successful, in order to prevent such a war from breaking out, in order to maintain international peace, to maintain international security, he adopted his famous one world, 4 policemen catchphrase. 4 policemen, they became 5. that is to say, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. So the aim was, thanks to multilateral realism, to maintain peace. That is to say, all these major powers agreed in his mind, should agree according to his project, to cooperate in order to maintain defensively the international order, to prevent any revisionist state from trying to upset the international order and to risk provoking the outbreak of a new world war. So America adopted at that time a kind of multilateral realist stance, but as you know, the USSR rejected. Though becoming member, accepting to become a member of the UN and therefore full member of the UN Security Council, the USSR rejected on the liberal dimension of Roosevelt's post-World War II plans. And this is the reason why America, during the Cold War, adopted a kind of policy that was liberal with its allies, and that was liberal and multilateral, and that was realist and multilateral with its adversaries. So no unilateral behavior almost throughout the Cold War. America's policy, foreign policy, was multilateral and liberal when dealing with the Western European allies and when dealing with Australia, with Japan, with Canada. And therefore, the US formed, together with these allies, the IMF, the World Bank, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and also the Atlantic Alliance, NATO, in the domain of security. And when dealing with the USSR and other communist states, America adopted its containment strategy. Containment strategy, that is to say, a defensive power political behavior, an offshore balancing strategy, that is to say, the aim of the US was to prevent the USSR from becoming too powerful comparatively to Western Europeans and comparatively to Japan, which was its ally in the Far East. The Cuban Missile Crisis, ladies and gentlemen, the Cuban Missile Crisis perfectly sums up the complementary, perfectly shows how these two strategies were complementary to each other. The liberal multilateral behavior with its Western allies, the realist multilateral behavior with its adversaries. You know what happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis? The USSR had deployed offensive missiles on Cuba that had become communist in 1959. The crisis broke out in 1962. American U-2 spying planes took pictures of these missiles. And what did America do? It did not try to destroy, to bomb the missiles, which would have meant an offensive political, power political attitude. It adopted a quarantine line, that is to say, it deployed warships, American warships, in order to prevent Soviet ships from bringing new missiles to Cuba. So it adopted a defensive political attitude, foreign political attitude, and it also adopted this defensive attitude because it was thinking of its European allies. Indeed, and here then we have the liberal multilateral dimension that characterized America's behavior when dealing with its Western European allies. America was thinking, or John F. Kennedy, the then president, was thinking that in the case of America bombing, in order to destroy the Soviet missiles in Cuba, what could the USSR have done? It could have retaliated by attacking West Berlin, which at that time was surrounded by the Eastern so-called DDR, Deutsche Demokratische Republik, the German Democratic Republic, as to say, the Soviet-controlled eastern part of the then Germany. So in order to avoid any risk for its ally, America took into account the interests of its ally. This is multilateralism. We do not act alone. We do not act unilaterally. We take into account the interests of our allies. Proves the liberal multilateralism complementary to the realist multilateralism, that is to say, the defensive power politics that America adopted when having to cope with what it perceived as the Soviet threat. The Cold War came to an end, you know that, in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, in 1991 with the definitive collapse of the USSR. And therefore the US, since 1989 or 1991, has no more major adversary to cope with. The USSR has collapsed in the domain of material power relations, and regarding ideological doctrines, communism no longer is credible. So the US became hegemonic in the material and in the ideological or normative domain. We saw this in our chapter 1. That is to say, America is absolutely able to act. It is free to act as it would like to. Nobody can prevent America from doing what it might be tempted to do. How then did the post-Cold War American presidents act? Well, they remained, at least during the first decades, and then again under Obama, they remained pretty moderate. They behaved, the overall behavior of the US is pretty moderate. This is the case first for George Herbert Bush, the father, was the president when the Cold War came to an end. He remained faithful to, loyal to multilateral defensive realism. For instance, during the crisis provoked by Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, he launched 2 operations. There's a Shield, a defensive operation, consisting in sending American troops to the Saudi Arabian deserts in order to prevent Iraq from potentially invading Saudi Arabia. Desert Shield. And then he launched the offensive operation Desert Storm on January 18, 1991 to force Saddam Hussein to defeat him militarily and to force him to withdraw his troops, which indeed happened. These 2 operations were authorized by the UN. In other words, George W. Bush respected the multilateral UN Charter, the Chapter 7 of UN Charter. And the US cooperated throughout this crisis with its European and even with its Arab allies. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, of course, Morocco contributed to Operation Desert Storm. So George Bush, defensive, multilateral, realist behavior. Bill Clinton, of course. Bill Clinton admittedly opted for somehow more offensive stance. When deciding to intervene, that America and NATO actually should intervene in Yugoslavia to put an end to the then civil wars, or to then civil wars that became international when Serbia intervened in Bosnia, in Croatia, in Kosovo. So Bill Clinton sent American troops to protect human rights. So it was offensive because he decided that America should intervene militarily, but it was offensive. But the aim pursued was defensive, to stop the killing of religious or ethnic minorities in Bosnia and in Kosovo. The aim was to defend human rights, not rather to impose, to spread them offensively. And the method used was multilateral, at least in Bosnia. Both the UN and America's allies were respected. The military operation, were decided by all the North Atlantic Treaty Organization members. And regarding Kosovo, though there was no UN authorization, and from this point of view, from the point of view of international law, it was a unilateral decision. It nevertheless took place with the agreement of the other members of North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So at least partly was it multilateral. Clinton also had to cope with Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein, who in 1998 decided to expel the UN inspectors. The UN inspectors had been imposed after the first war in 1991. The role of the inspectors was to make sure that Saddam Hussein did not try to acquire secretly weapons of mass destruction. And so Saddam Hussein expelled them in 1998, and various voices in America appealed to Clinton and told him that he should intervene militarily. But Clinton refused. He respected the UN Charter. The UN Charter only accepts defensive wars when there is a breach of peace. And in this case, there was no breach of peace. So Clinton, in general, respected multilateralism, and overall, though he adopted some liberal dimensions by protecting human rights, he basically remained defensive and not offensive. The change then, he did not necessarily want to promote, but rather to defend human rights. To shift away, the evolution then, the change, intervened with George Walker Bush, the son, George Bush Jr., after 9/11. And George Bush adopted a unilateral liberal foreign policy consisting in imposing offensively human rights values or American values, also American interests, but the discourse that shaped and justified this intervention was based on American values. And this shift was notably influenced by various members of the George W. Bush administration, notably Paul Wolfowitz, number 2 of the Pentagon, and Richard Perle, a special advisor to George W. Bush. They formed the group of neoconservatives within the Bush administration. So their vision was an offensive, unilateral, liberal vision, claiming that America should exert a kind of imperial leadership by imposing violently its values, which had already prevailed over communism 10 years before. Listen to the neoconservatives. What's the point of being the greatest, most powerful nation in the world and not having an imperial role? The most powerful nations always had an imperial role in the past. It would be natural for the US. It would be natural for the US to play a far more dominant role in world politics. Not what we are doing now in the 1990s, beginning of the 2000s, but to command. We need to command, to impose offensively our will and to give order to what is to be done. What then should America concretely do according to neoconservatives? Look at document number 3 in your Moodle file. I quote to many the idea of America using its power to promote changes of regime in nations ruled by dictators rings of utopianism. It seems utopian to many people that America should use power. In fact, listen to this, it is eminently realistic, not realist, not realist, but realistic. That is to say, it's feasible. We already have seen dictatorships toppled in such unlikely places in the past, such as the Philippines, Indonesia, Chile, Nicaragua, Paraguay, Taiwan, and South Korea. All these former autocratic regimes turned into democratic ones. Why should it be utopian to imagine a change of regime in a place like Iraq? And we, America, should help Iraq to become a democracy by overthrowing Saddam Hussein's regime violently, and this is what America did. Operation Iraqi Freedom 2003. This Operation Iraqi Freedom was then the implementation of the neoconservatives' political program. The implementation of the so-called liberal or democratic domino doctrine. The domino doctrine goes back to the 1950s when America was afraid of losing Vietnam. If it lost Vietnam, then all the other Southeast Asian states would become communist, like the dominoes falling. Here it is reversed, a positive domino doctrine, that is to say, if one Middle East state becomes democratic thanks to our military intervention, then all the other ones will be democratic too, and then America will be better off in the region because it will have a lot of democratic, that is to say, American-friendly states in the region. Therefore, George W. Bush's intervention is, foreign policy is unilateral and liberal. It wants to impose America's imperial leadership. Obama, when he came to power, adopted fairly exactly the opposite. He, first of all, reintroduced multilateralism. Multilateralism, for instance, when dealing with Iran, by signing the Iran nuclear deal, he negotiated with Iran together with the 4 other members, permanent members of the UN Security Council, even plus Germany, or even with Germany. I feel free to remember that at that time in France, first Kouchner under Sarkozy's presidency, and then Fabius under Hollande's presidency were favorable to a military intervention against Iran. So this gives you an idea of Obama's difference. He also practiced multilateralism when normalizing America's relations with Cuba. Regarding the substance of Obama's foreign policy, it was overall defensive. It was defensive when he decided to reduce, and therefore to withdraw troops, American troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. It was defensive when he adopted the so-called leading from behind strategy in Libya, when France, Sarkozy, and Great Britain, Cameron, launched their military intervention to get rid of Gaddafi. Obama's troops, American troops, intervened after 2 weeks or so within the NATO framework, and this is what Americans called the leading from behind strategy. They did not take the initiative as Bush had done unilaterally in 2003. He also adopted a fairly defensive attitude in Syria. First in 2013, when he refused to intervene militarily, despite Assad using chemical weapons against parts of his own population. And even in 2014, when America intervened militarily, America adopted the light footprint strategy. This is a no sending of massive American troops, but special forces, special agents that were able to launch standoff strikes, that is to say, bombing from distance, which permitted to avoid American soldiers to be killed. Of course, this is possible thanks to the new technology of drones, which permits to project power without projecting vulnerability. Overall, then, Obama adopted a fairly defensive, realist strategy, no offensive spread of American values, as opposed to George W. Bush. And this overall realist strategy is a peculiar, a singular, a kind of realism. It is sometimes called Christian realism or ethic realism, which goes back to an interwar American realist, more specifically Ronald Niebuhr is his name, who published 2 major books, Moral Man and Immoral Society, and another one which is called The Children of Light and the Children of Darkness. Christian realism. Niebuhr in his books, proposed that America should, of course, because of its exceptionalism, Jefferson, America is exceptional, therefore it should defend itself. It should defend, of course, itself against evil. This is a theological kind of realism. So evil is important. It should fight against evil, which was represented by the Nazis, which was represented by the Soviet totalitarianism during the Cold War, and to some extent by Islamic terrorism nowadays. But though America should defend itself, it should not be tempted by imperial arrogance. It should not try to shape the world according to its own values, because this will never work. So Nebo rejected America's crusade in Vietnam, which was considered to be a crusade rather than a defensive war. And Obama also, maybe you know that, when he came to power, held this very important discourse in Cairo, in Egypt, where he rejected the clash of civilization thesis, opposing the West to the Muslim world. And it is this discourse that earned him the Peace Nobel Prize. So Obama adopted a fairly moderate, prudent, cautious doctrine, at least when compared to Bush, to George W. Bush. Listen to Obama. This is a speech he held at the West Point Military Academy in 2014. It's document number 4. The US is and remains the one indispensable nation. So yes, America is exceptional. It is different from other states. But the world is changing. This presents opportunity, but also new dangers. To say that we have an interest in pursuing freedom is not to say that every problem has a military solution. We will not defend liberty by sending our troops. Since World War II, some of our most costly mistakes came not from our restraint, but from our willingness to rush into military adventures without thinking through the consequences, without building international support, that is to say, acting unilaterally, while we should, according to him, have acted multilaterally. Without legitimacy for our actions, only the UN can provide this legitimacy. Without leveling with the American people about the sacrifices required, because American wars are costly for the taxpayers. So he rejects this offensive behavior. Last sentence: tough talk often draws headlines. Tough talk often draws headlines, but war rarely conforms to slogans. War rarely conforms to slogans. Wars are unpredictable. We know when we launch them, but we do not know what will happen. So let's behave moderately. And tough talk often draws headlines. So some politicians are tempted by tough talk. And maybe unconsciously, of course, he anticipated Donald Trump, who is very fond of tough talk when tweeting at a dizzying speed all his messages on Twitter. So what about Trump, ladies and gentlemen? Which combination of America's tradition does he reflect? Does his foreign policy behavior reflect? Let's listen to his inaugural speech in January 2017 to have an idea of what he's thinking of.
We assembled here today are issuing a new decree to be heard in every city, in every foreign capital, and in every hall of power. From this day forward, a new vision will govern our land. From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first. Every decision on trade, on taxes, on immigration, on foreign affairs will be made to benefit American workers and American families. We must protect our borders from the ravages of other countries, making our products, stealing our companies, and destroying our jobs. Protection will lead to great prosperity and strength. I will fight for you with every breath in my body, and I will never, ever let you down.
I will never.
We assembled here today.
So, I will never, ever let you down. So this is America First doctrine, the slogan of George W. Bush. What is the underlying philosophy of this America First doctrine in Trump's behavior on the international scene? Is there is this reflecting one of these traditions that we had a look at throughout this chapter? Actually, none, ladies and gentlemen, of the four traditions underlies this America First doctrine. It is probably a fifth one, abandoned throughout the 19th century, even during the 19th century, which goes back to the 19th century, which was abandoned during the 20th century, that even during the 19th century did not survive. He who is at the origin of this fifth tradition, Andrew Jackson, the American president in the 1830s, who's at the origin of the so-called Jacksonian tradition. That Jacksonian tradition is a term coined by American expert, American historian Walter Russell Mead. You can have a look at his typology in document number 5 on the file, and you can also have an idea of what his doctrines of his four traditions consist in the following conversation that he had with a professor of the University of Berkeley. Listen to Walter Russell Mead presenting his typology of four categories, four doctrines. The Jacksonian one will be the last one.
There are four approaches, four visions of foreign policy of the national interest that shape the way Americans think and argue about the world.
And they are. We should go over them very briefly.
Well, in no particular order, the Hamiltonian school, I name them after the heroes in American history. And I really try, by the way, in the book to be impartial, to try to describe each school really the way someone who belonged to that school would describe it, rather than saying, well, this is my pet school and I hate all the others and they're all stupid. The Hamiltonians are people who think the United States needs to become the same kind of great power in the world that Britain was at its peak. We need to have a strong economy. The federal government should be working hand in glove with large corporations and great business interests to advance their interests in overseas trade. We should try to build a global order of trade and economic relations that keep us so rich that we can afford to do what Britain used to do, which is to keep any one country from getting too strong in Europe and Asia to affect our vital interests, to threaten us. And when a country threatens to take over either Europe or Asia, then we build up a coalition against them and bring them down either by peace or war. And that's been a vision that has moved a lot of people. Again, George Washington probably to some degree had this view of American foreign policy. Then you've got kind of its opposite, the Jeffersonian view, which says, look, the United States government should not go hand in glove with corporations. That will undermine democracy. It'll get us involved with despots abroad. We'll be supporting evil dictators because some American corporation has economic interests that are advanced by this. And also, this is going to undermine democracy at home. So I think, you look at somebody like Ralph Nader as a Jeffersonian who sees the WTO as a corporate big government plot against democracy at home and democracy abroad. But at the same time, this Hamiltonian goal of a grand global order gets us involved in conflicts with people overseas. So we're involved in the Middle East, so people hate us in the Middle East, so they come and attack us, as in September 11th. If we'd never set foot in the Middle East, we wouldn't have this problem, say Jeffersonians. And again, that's the logic of anti-war movements. And we've certainly we've seen a lot of Jeffersonian stuff over the generations. Wilsonians, I think we all intuitively know what that is. It's this belief in the United Nations, international law, that the United States should be pushing our values around the world and turning other countries into democracies, whether they like it or not. And the U.S. should also work multilaterally and in institutions. We should be supporting things like the International Criminal Court, Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and we should not be unilateralist in our approach. We should put human rights ahead of trade, and so on and so forth. Then finally, you've got a group called the Jacksonians for Andrew Jackson. And one way I describe it is just to talk about an incident in American history that I think illustrates a lot of the school's value. When Andrew Jackson was a general in 1818, and he was fighting a war against the Creek Indians in Georgia. Florida at the time was still under Spanish rule, and there were 2 Englishmen in Florida selling arms to the Indians who were then attacking U.S. forces in Georgia. Jackson took the U.S. Army across the international frontier into Spanish territory without any permissions or any UN resolutions or anything. Went in there, arrested the 2 Brits, brought them back to the United States, tried them before a military tribunal, and hanged them. And this did cause outrage in Europe. They said these people have no respect for international law and so on and so forth. But it made Jackson so popular in the U.S. that his election to the presidency was just really a matter of time after 1818. And this kind of don't bother with people abroad unless they bother you, but if they attack you, then do everything you can. So in the 1940s, 30s, Hitler takes over Paris, we don't move an inch. He starts exterminating the Jews, we don't move an inch. Japan is doing all of this stuff all over Asia. And on December 6, 1941, any opinion poll in the country would have said that most Americans wanted to stay out of World War II. Then December 7th, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, and suddenly the polls change. Jacksonians, when somebody attacks the hive, you come swarming out of the hive and you sting them to death. And Jacksonians, when it comes to war, they don't believe in any of this limited war. They don't believe particularly in laws of war. War is about fighting, killing, and winning with as few casualties as possible on your side. But you don't worry about casualties on the other side. That's their problem. They shouldn't have started the war if they didn't want casualties.
So for school.
So, ladies and gentlemen, Walter Russell Mead's typology is both close and yet different from the categories that I did distinguish on, notably the basis of McDougall. Anyway, what I want you to remember is how he defines Jacksonianism, the tradition going back to Andrew Jackson, president of the US in the first half of the 19th century. Beyond the specific points regarding international relations, Jackson reflected what we may call the cultural, political, and class distance, separating rural America from what we may call the Washington-based establishment, the Washington-based elites. So he embodied what nowadays we would call, rightly or wrongly, populism. It is a profoundly nationalist tradition, which rests upon the distinction between us and them, between our community and the world abroad, barbarians, to use a term of the past. Jacksonians are, this is the last point emphasized by Mead, are isolationist. They are not interested in international affairs. They're not concerned about international affairs. Only when these international affairs do affect negatively their happiness, their private life. So they are economically nationalist. And to some extent, Trump's protectionism reflects this dimension. They adopt an anti-immigrant stance. And you know that Trump, when he came to power, was promising a definitive wall, a border wall, to prevent South Americans to cross the Mexican border in Texas, in Arizona, in California, in New Mexico. They are deeply suspicious about any multilateral institution. And you know that we saw this last week. Trump acts unilaterally, making fun of what the United Nations, the other United Nations members might think of his unilaterally recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital, of his unilaterally putting an end to the Iranian deal, of his unilaterally refusing to accept and trying to ratify the Paris Agreement. And we saw last week that he no longer wants America to be the policeman of the world, as in Roosevelt's project in 1944, 1945. So he rejects multilateral institutions, globalism, globalist institutions. And of course, when America is under danger, is threatened or perceived to be threatened, Jacksonians adopt a paranoid response to aliens. When they feel provoked, they act mercilessly, ruthlessly. This goes back to their conception of Indians. A good Indian is a dead Indian. They ignore completely any law that should be respected during times of war, especially when they are fighting against, I quote, dishonorable enemies. And these dishonorable enemies are pretty often colored people: Indians, red Indians, black Americans, yellow Japanese, and nowadays Muslim terrorists. Remember his Muslim ban when he arrived to power. So I did not, ladies and gentlemen, refer to this tradition in my analysis for the reason I already mentioned. It was peculiar to, I would say, 1 or 2 decades preceding and during Andrew Jackson's presidency. It was no longer put into practice after, during the 19th isolationist century, that's to say the Old Testament. It was all the less so, of course, adopted and influencing American foreign policy since America became international or internationalist or interventionist, that is to say, after Wilson, or at least after World War II. But it obviously revives. It becomes once again important nowadays, as we can have an idea when listening to Trump's speech to the UN held in 2017. Listen to Trump.
As President of the United States, I will always put America first. Just like you, as the leaders of your countries, will always and should always put your countries first. The scourge of our planet today is a small group of rogue regimes that violate every principle on which the United Nations is based. They respect neither their own citizens nor the sovereign rights of their countries. If the righteous many do not confront the wicked few, then evil will triumph. The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime. The Iran deal was one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the United States has ever entered into. Frankly, that deal is an embarrassment to the United States, and I don't think you've heard the last of it, believe me. Major portions of the world are in conflict, and some, in fact, are going to hell. But the powerful people in this room, under the guidance and auspices of the United Nations, can solve many of these vicious and complex problems.
So Rocket Man, it's an allusion to the dictator of North Korea. Iran are rogue actors, just as Indians, just as the Japanese, just as Muslim terrorists nowadays are rogue actors, thugs, gangsters that America should get rid of. This is tough talk, because until now, his behavior was not very corresponding to what he pronounced in his discourses, in his UN speeches, or maybe also in his State of the Union addresses, which I would like you to listen to if you are interested in doing so. Will there be, ladies and gentlemen, a 5th State of the Union address next January 2021? Well, American voters will tell us. They will decide in more or less exactly 5 weeks. But before we will know the results of American voters, we have to listen to other lectures on international politics. So I hope you will be back next week. Thank you very much for listening to today's class. Have a great day, ladies and gentlemen, and please come back next week. Goodbye.